Hey guys, welcome to another episode of LJ's Garage. You're probably wondering why I have you in an abandoned parking lot to talk about an E30. Well, to talk about vintage cars altogether. And I know that some people would say classic, vintage, it's all interchangeable, but to me, we're at a point where this is considered vintage, anything over 20 years in the state of Florida. But then there's classic, which is talking about, to me personally, anything in like the 50s, the 60s, the 30s, all of those times, a Model T if you may. But either way, my goal today is to kind of tell you guys what you're getting yourself into when you buy one of these classic vintage cars. Nobody told me that birds would shit on you with a convertible. All right, so this is the E30. This is a 1987, and from far away, you would think this thing looks really good, and I would agree with you. However, it does have some flaws. It is patinaed in areas, it is weathered, it is worn. It's lived a good life, and my job now is to see if I can keep this thing living an even better life. Yeah. What did I just get myself into? That's another story. One of the biggest things is rust. When you buy a car that's old and withered, it unfortunately has seen better days, and rust is one of the big things that you have to worry about. You see that? A little bit of light coming through. Ugh. But this has a tiny bit of rust going on down in here, which is a common spot on these cars. So whenever you buy a car that's old and vintage, you want to make sure that you know the common rust spots on that car. It's a killer for these things because you're going to get to a point where the car becomes so rusty that it's not savable. And so you want to get ahead of it and find low rust, which low rust means higher cost, higher value, and those type of things. So just for full transparency, I bought this for about 10 grand. I could have got it for a little bit more because it had a lot of parts and everything to fix certain concerns that this car had. I negotiated to save some money. I didn't want any parts or anything like that. And some people would say probably overpaid a little bit, but some people would say this is probably priced just right, considering that the next area that you're going to worry about is the interior. I'm going to show you guys this interior. This red interior is really difficult to find, and if you guys see any of these little speckles, that's my fault. I was detailing the car and I got the buffer wheel and I sprayed polish all over it. So just made a white sticky mess all over the interior. But the interior is another spot. But anyways, my point being, this is sun damaged, faded, lived a good life. This is all refreshed, and from what you guys could probably see, this interior is in great condition. I would say it's a solid 8 out of 10 interior, considering what this car is and what it's been through and all of that good stuff. So to me, this was well worth it. But you've got to figure out what your budget's going to be and if your budget's actually going to get you something that's worthwhile. For this car, in really great condition, these go for about 15 to 20 on the higher end, and on the low end, about 6,000, 5,000 not running, or maybe even just a rust bucket. This is not either of those things. Not very like mint, but also not a rust bucket. I got to the point where cosmetically this car was sound, and mechanically this car was really exceptional. A couple things that I want to mention as I'm talking about those type of issues is under the hood. So when you buy a classic car, every day I feel like I find something new with these. So as I'm driving this, I've probably put about 250 miles on this car already since ownership. One thing I know is this door lock doesn't work anymore. And I know that sometimes when I put the top up on the convertible, this window gets stuck on the top. So what I have to do is when the window is coming up, I have to kind of push it into the tracks so that it goes where it needs to go. Little minor things, big time. But let me go ahead and pop the hood because I want to talk about the next area of concern with these. So with any classic vintage car, you're going to have a car that has had several owners. This one's probably had about 6 in its lifetime, which is fairly low considering it's 37 years old, in my mind at least. But you're going to want to look under here and you're going to want to find out what the life of this car is. So for me, I know that there's a couple electric issues where I'm like, interesting. Who cut these wires right here? Things like that are going to happen and you won't really have any clue. Even with the sensor right here, I'm like, why are you electric taped? Is that for your protection, my protection, somebody's protection? Coolant temp sensor even actually legit? Then you see stuff like this and you're like, what the heck happened? There's all these little things that are going to raise flags and concerns and issues, and you have to kind of decide, if the car is mechanically in great condition. Even if something drives and moves under its own power, that's a huge win, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the car is ready to go. With this one, I asked the previous owner, I said, are there any leaks, anything major that I need to worry about? He said, no, all the leaks have been taken care of. And the service records do say that this had a lot of seals replaced and a lot of gaskets taken care of. However, after having this car for almost 2 months now, I can tell you that this car leaks in many places, which is my own fault because, that's just what it is. I could have spent more time with the car doing all that stuff to figure out what exactly caused that. We'll get back to leaks in just a second, but something else that I want to mention is, with a car being aged, there's going to be certain issues. Things like this kind of stood out to me at the time, and I was like, oh, this thing's going to need a new coolant reservoir. Okay, cool, that's not a big deal. However, those things are flags and concerns, and you've got to figure out kind of what you can handle. Oh, ew. But yeah, just simple things that, when I was looking at the car, I didn't really dig too deep into. So you want to make sure you check all that stuff too. But just that coolant reservoir and the washer fluid reservoir, they've lived 37 years and it's very clear. But are those deal breakers? Absolutely not. But something that you want to make sure that you're fully aware of. The next thing on this car that I learned kind of after the fact, something I know when I'm buying newer cars, is mismatched body panels, things like that. With this car, you'll notice that I did this. That's a whole nother separate video. But this car had pinstripes on this door, no pinstripes on that front fender, no pinstripes on this rear fender. But then if you come over to this side, it had pinstripes all along, all the way down. And looking at this, you see these little spots right here? If you look at this really closely, but then let's go on the other side, you can see that this is a little bit more mismatched than the other side. Could it be that this panel was replaced? Very likely that this whole front fender was. This car does have 2 accidents, one in like the 90s and then the other one in the early 2000s. None of them caused airbags. None of them were anything serious. They were all like low speed parking lot, things like that. So I say that to say, make sure you know the car history and you look for those things. Mismatched body panels on true classics can be a hindrance to resale value and what the car is actually worth. I know that stuff like, the classic Mustangs, you want to have matching VINs all over the body panels, things like that. So just keep that in mind. With this one being an 80s car, I'm not too worried about the mismatched panels. Not a big deal. If that were the case, you can kind of see it a little bit, just depends. The other thing you're going to have is it's really difficult to find certain parts. Like this bumper right here, I believe it's the MTech 1 front bumper. It's really hard to find one of these that are reasonably priced. And I say that to say, do your research on what the parts cost way ahead of time so that you know what you're getting yourself into. I've had a parts list for this car for probably 5 or 6 years, so I'm fairly familiar with what things cost. And I've set a budget on this car for about $2,000 to $3,000. That's kind of where, after that, I feel like anything past that, I'm spending too much on the car. If it's not going to cause any major mechanical issues, if it's not a major cosmetic upgrade, then I'm not really going to spend too much money on it. Like this interior is probably going to stay the way it is. And this is probably one of the biggest things that I'm going to get rid of and change. And it's not so much because I hate having that screen. I actually do want to finish running the backup camera. I just have to find a better unit. Not to mention, with a car that's 37 years old, the other problem is the electrical concerns. So if you're not someone that's good with electrical, keep that in mind. These wires are so old and so brittle that sometimes you just have weird issues. This is one of those cars that every time you drive it, there's something that it needs. Another issue, cracked dashes. You would think that that's an easy fix. No, because, you could find an E30 dash, but that's not an easy project to take on. But yeah, there's just a lot of little projects that continue to pile up and pile up and pile up. And I think this car is well worth putting some money into because it's a great starting platform. I can tell you guys that this is one of the best cars I've ever owned, and this thing is far from mint condition, but it is so clean and so nice. And realistically, if I just continue to add fluids and top it off here and there, the leaks are so small and minor, other than my garage becoming a little drippy mess. This thing is a champ. It runs well, drives well, feels good, and I can't wait to have the suspension cleaned up and get that rattle to go away. And then on top of that, I do need a new convertible top, which you would think something like a convertible top is not a big deal, but this is down most of the time, or in the garage with the top down, because my convertible top is ugly and it leaks. So I thought that was going to be an easy project, but there are very specific steps that you have to take to get the top switched out, make sure everything lines up right, and I don't really want to do it. So that's probably something that I will have a shop do that's familiar with replacing convertible tops. And this one has so many components and parts to it that it seems like it's more complex than I give it credit for. So I'd rather not underestimate that and mess it up. So you've got to figure out what maintenance items does this thing need. I can tell you right now, one of the next things that this needs is a valve adjustment. That's something that's supposed to be done on these cars, I think every 80,000 miles, maybe 100,000 miles. But there's little quirks, right? So under here, this exhaust jumps off the hangers all the time. And if you look further down back there, you can see my hanger actually broke completely on this backside. Right there. You guys can see that, hopefully. Wait, I've got to figure out how to keep this hanger from popping off. Such an extra project to have to deal with. But aftermarket exhaust, and it's got upgraded suspensions because this car has all sorts of different parts all over it, and I don't even know exactly what parts are what. But when I tell you that every day it's something, I drive this car, I find some new project. Third brake light's leaking. Let me go back in the trunk. You know, there's got this random little hole right here. I'm just like, really? You just had to? Cracks in the taillights, something that I should fix. Probably won't for a while. But yeah, there's always something to do to continue to make this car better. Even something simple as, like, let's say we open up this gas tank. Look at that. It's pretty rough in there. All rough. But I don't have the time to address every single problem in this. I do want to do a lot. Even my front speakers don't work. You know, I need a visor right here. And all these little parts add up. So set your budget, figure out what works for you, figure out what you can do by yourself, figure out if you're going to even do any of the work yourself. There's a couple things on this car I just will not do, such as the valve adjustment, because I don't want to do the first one and mess it up. Yeah, there's just always something to do with these project cars. But I would say just do lots of research and find videos on your specific classic or vintage car and just go from there. Just really take the time to get to know them, because there's so many things, especially with these older cars before we really had like a really strong internet presence. It's hard to find a lot of things. Like, I didn't even know that this car didn't come with that. I don't really know what car that's even from, and I'm still trying to figure that out. So if you guys are finding this and you're E30 enthusiasts, please let me know. Is that where does that mount to? It doesn't. This is just free floating. So I gotta fix that. So that's the car. But everything on this works. Headlights work. Even my electric side mirrors work. I wish they were folding, because that would be kind of nice, but I know that was before its times. This works. All my temp gauges work. Everything besides my odometer. Sometimes the RPM gauge does get a little sticky, so sometimes it'll go from like 2,500 to 3,000 RPM, like very drastically. It's not all smooth. But let me go ahead and start it up. That's her. But yeah, something else is figuring out how much it costs to fix your powertrain, so you know like what the risk is. For these, I could find a manual transmission used for probably $1,500, which is cheap. Some of them as low as like under $1,000. Same with these engines. Something else that I want to talk about on the interior is, you can see I kind of had to finesse some screws, and things are just held into place kind of sometimes shortcut ways. You can see underneath here, I'm missing some panels. All these little pieces, if you're not familiar with these cars, you end up having to find out all the little pieces you're missing. So there's always these little random things that you have to figure out. I mean, there's just so much that is just odds and ends and bits. It's a work in progress, man. Stuff like checking your heat, your air conditioning. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In this car, I mean, it works great. AC and heat. This thing's so fun. And again, the manual on this is impressively good. I get a little bit of issues sometimes here and there going into first gear, so I sometimes have to go from second to first in order to get everything to line up again. But other than that, no issues, no concerns, no problems. Turbo! Just kidding, there is no turbo. And I know right now a lot of people are actually going back to classic cars because the analog feel, the getting away from electronics, disconnecting from computers and stuff like that. So I think it's always worthwhile to do that. And I think it's a great move. That's why I did it. But yeah, that's my experience so far and things that I look for when I'm buying a classic vintage car. This is my second E30, so this is kind of not that new to me, but I do want to get into other classics, the Beetles, you know, a Mustang. There's all these different ones that I want to, you know, tackle one of these days. So I figured it would be nice to share with you guys some of the things that, you know, stand out to me and the things that I look for when I'm buying, and how I kind of figure out my budget with certain things. So hopefully that helps you guys. If you're new to the channel, consider hitting that subscribe button. Otherwise, I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.